Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
The RSA has always been a progressive organisation. We've been around for 260 years, and as the world has changed many times over, so has our account of progress and the contribution that we might make to it. Tonight I'm speaking to the latest account, a new worldview and mission. We call it the power to create. My argument is that we are at the cusp of an unprecedented opportunity. Powerful social and technological change means that we can now realistically commit to the aspiration that every citizen should live a creative life. But this major step in human progress will not happen unless we're able to identify and to seek to remove the high barriers that currently stand in its way. So, what do I mean by a creative life? Creativity is a slippery concept. The first definition offered by Google is the use of imagination or new ideas to create something. Not only is this obviously circular, but it begs the question, what is the something that has to be created to count as creativity? For some people, it's a quality belonging to certain activities, art, culture, design. Indeed, the RSA argues strongly for the links between cultural flourishing and social and economic progress. For others, the concept of creativity can be emptied of virtue, as in creative accounting, or the job title given to people who use their undoubted talents to dream up advertising slogans. But whilst we can't all make the contribution of artists or the income of advertising executives, there's one thing to which we can all aspire: to live creative lives, lives of which we are the author, lives which allow us to be the best people we can be. What does such an aspiration mean for our opportunities and responsibilities? How does it differ from the social democratic emphasis on equality or the liberal rights on freedom? Let me give you my version. The first aspect of the creative life is individual freedom. As liberals say, as long as we're not directly inhibiting others, we should be able to think our own thoughts, use our own words, and make our own decisions. But as Amartya Sen and others have argued, creative freedom also involves resources. We talk about how savings, or educational qualifications, or time give us the freedom to pursue our choices. And we use the third idea of freedom. This refers to our capabilities, our dispositions. We talk about people being free of drugs, free of mental illness, free from a narrow or fundamentalist worldview. Do we have the knowledge, attitude, temperament to be free? Freedom makes the creative life possible, but our choices determine whether we fulfill that possibility. It's not a state that can be achieved, but a continuous process of building a life which is unique and meaningful. Chinese artist Ai Weiwei says, "Creativity is the power to act." So, prizing creativity means honouring the individual, but we must never imagine that a creative life can be realised apart from our existence as social beings. As Richard Rorty has written, "We are only individuals in as much as we are social. None of us has a self to be faithful to except the one which has been cobbled together in interchanges with parents, siblings, friends, enemies, churches and governments. Our creations, a business, an artistic performance, a social movement, a product, a service, an idea, simply an act of generosity, are only possible because of the people around us. It's not just individuals that we describe as being more or less creative, but organisations, places, societies. We think of creativity being the fount of high culture, but culture, in the broader sense of the values, expectations and norms that pervade state, market and community, are critical determinants of a society's creative capacity. To see the creative life as a substantive virtue urges our commitment to a society in which this life is realistically attainable, not just for ourselves, but for our fellow citizens. And the power to create combines an idealistic view of human flourishing with democratic inclusiveness. As Roberto Ungar said last year on this stage, the true goal of progressives must be now, as it was in the 19th century, a larger life for the ordinary man and woman. Yet from Aristotle to the Victorians, philosophers and social commentators, with an ambitious, high-minded idea of the good life well lived, have also tended to be elitists, assuming that such an ideal was beyond the capabilities of the masses. But all human beings have the capacity to be the authors of their own lives. Meaning-making is what marks us out as a species. We are born with the muscles for creativity, muscles that grow with the exercise of self-determination. In short, the power to create asserts that all citizens can and should live creative lives. So this is our vision. Is there any reason to believe the power to create is anything other than a distant aspiration, a star to navigate by, but not yet a road to follow? We believe that there is. We believe we're reaching a tipping point at which the possibility of and the need for a creative citizenry looms before us and presents us with urgent choices. This moment of inflection is the result of a set of interconnected changes leading to a step change in both the demand for and supply of creativity in modern society. The first changes are around human capability and appetite. In all our breastbeating about the failings of our education system, we can forget just how much more educated today's citizens are. In less than 2 generations, we've gone from under 10% to almost half of young people experiencing higher education. We might lag behind other countries in some areas, but our young people are among the best in the world when it comes to problem solving. Despite the many pressures they face, today's young people are critiquing narrow materialism in arguably a more nuanced and concrete way than their grandparents attempted in the 60s. RSA research shows more young people than ever before wanting the autonomy of owning their own business, even though the returns and security are often lower than a traditional job. Among those opting for employment, a growing proportion say they make decisions influenced by the values and ethical practices of employers. And as consumers too, young people are at the forefront of an emerging sharing economy. More broadly, a set of intertwined factors including rising affluence, a decline in the importance of tradition and deference, exposure of modern citizens through travel, immigration and the media to different cultures are all leading to more people in the developed world aspiring to what the World Values Survey calls self-expression. Technology is the second great engine of change. In its wake, many barriers to creative expression and enterprise have come tumbling down. The internet has led to a quantum leap in affordable, easy access to key tools of creativity, learning, communicating, trading, collaborating. Its pioneers thought the World Wide Web would be primarily a tool for the exchange of information amongst experts. But when the financial and other costs of generating and sharing content started to fall, a massive global appetite was revealed. In music, films, photographs, blogs, apps, social networks, hundreds of millions of people generating content, the overwhelming majority of it for free. Following in the footsteps of pioneers like Wikipedia and Linux, again and again the creation of new, free or inexpensive, easy-to-use platforms have released waves of human creativity, entrepreneurial aspiration, collaborative endeavour. Peer-to-peer and sharing economy platforms for the social enterprises like FreeCycle and Streetbank or commercial like Airbnb enable anyone to trade or exchange, blurring the boundaries between buyer and seller, profit-making and sharing. And human trust and reciprocity is as important as digital algorithms to the success of these platforms. Now, in our wonderment at the pace of innovation, we must resist technological determinism. The internet of invention and cultural self-expression is also the internet of porn, hate and trivia. Technology can and is sometimes used to reduce autonomy and dull creativity. Indeed, as technology becomes ever more central to our identities, we need to have a much more explicitly political debate about who controls it and for what purpose. Nevertheless, in aggregate, across a wide spectrum of human activity, greater creativity is being enabled and encouraged. The network economics are exponential. The demand for creativity drives supply, the supply of creativity drives demand, and new platforms drive both. And the impact has barely even begun. The first generation for whom it's been part of the fabric of their entire lives are now reaching adulthood. The social web, pervasive not just in terms of connectivity, but it's an intrinsic part of modern identity. It will change the town hall, Whitehall, schools, business, social enterprises, international relations in ways we cannot yet conceive, let alone adapt to. In short, the internet has the capacity to be the most powerful accelerator of creativity in human history. Also, the relationship between creativity on and offline is unpredictable but largely positive. The music industry feared downloading would obliterate its profits. Instead, it's transformed its business model. We consume much, much more music. People who used to just listen to music are now much more likely to spend their money being part of the experience at concerts and festivals. From computer-aided design to making technologies like 3D printing, new technologies making it easier and easier to turn ideas into material products. All around the world, people are using the net to seek out new routes to personal development, connection, and self-expression. And it turns out that we need this appetite. The new demands we make on citizens represent the third trend that could take us to a creativity tipping point. Take the CBI's definition of employability. They say it's the ability to work in a team, a willingness to demonstrate initiative and original thought, self-discipline in starting and completing tasks. Various factors, including the accelerating pace of change in markets, the need for continuous innovation, the expectation of a more personalised service, the growing appetite for authenticity in products and services, all of these things increase the premium on the capacity of employees to be creative and self-motivated. And in the search for new insights and products, more companies are also acknowledging and encouraging consumer-led innovation. The rise of intelligent robots has led pessimistic and optimistic commentators to predict respectively either massive unemployment or a world of leisure. But as you will all know, such predictions have been made and confounded before. A more likely outcome is a further restructuring of labour markets and market values, with consumers and service users putting a greater premium on the creative, effective touches that only human engagement can bring. Let the robots do the robotic work, let humans flourish creatively. And increasingly, the government too wants creative citizens. The mid-20th century model of industrial production, Fordism as it's sometimes called, emphasised standardised forms of mass production delivered through large centralised organisation. The modern welfare state was built on largely the same principles. But as the weaknesses of that model emerged, as many social needs have grown or become more intractable, as economic crises have spawned waves of austerity, we've come to see that the model of a paternalistic state delivering uniform services to a passive, undifferentiated citizenry is neither progressive nor practical. Conservative local authorities might refer to the big society. Labour wants the idea of the cooperative council. But whatever the label, forward-thinking public agencies, and there are still too few, are reaching a radical conclusion. Their citizens and communities are not just bundles of need, they are also huge untapped assets. Using ethnography, public engagement, social network analysis, agencies are trying to understand those assets and how they can be mobilised. Methods of co-design and co-delivery are being pursued, blurring the boundary between professional and client. A whole set of initiatives like home share and shared lives are modern examples of an old ideal, reciprocal civic relationships, offering an alternative and adjunct to public services. Encouraged by the principle of payment by results, there's a massive growth in social enterprise. And the world of policy and service innovation, which used to be largely closed, is now opened by big data, with potentially anyone with the time and inclination able to spot trends, test hypotheses, develop solutions. Of course, huge challenges like caring for an ageing population, tackling inequality, and particularly responding to climate change require concerted action at national, local and international level. But our strategies will also require an adaptive and creative citizenry with the skills and confidence to develop its own solutions. So, a better educated, more self-expressive population, the impact of technology, the demand for new attributes in workers and citizens. These are all factors taking us towards a society in which we can hope to live what Unger called a larger life. But the potential tipping point might not be reached, because there is another side to this story, the barriers to a society of creative possibility. Culture has a vital and independent significance, and this is the first barrier. In our culture, the idea that everyone can and should live creatively is not yet accepted as an aspiration, let alone a practical imperative. We can see this, for example, in the relatively low priority given to autonomy, engagement and motivation in assessing the value of education and employment. 43% of the workforce, 13 million people in the UK, report that they aren't using their potential and skills at work. It's not that we don't see living a creative life as a good thing, nor that anyone doesn't seem to want it for themselves. In a style reminiscent of resistance to earlier movements for improvements in universal rights or entitlements, the measures necessary to achieve greater autonomy and fulfilment for all are opposed on the implicit grounds that those at the top should be able to preserve their privileges, while the hoi polloi show no sign of wanting their lives of docile subservience to be disturbed by higher aspirations. A concrete symbol of our limited commitment to the ideal of creative lives for all is the persistence of educational privilege and intergenerational inequality, the past devouring the future, in Thomas Piketty's memorable phrase. The point is not inequality per se, but that key resources that foster creative aspirations and choices are not utilised to the maximum benefits of society as a whole. If we judge social progress by the scale of human creativity, extreme inequality is deeply inefficient. Take capital. Not only is it concentrated in a certain strata of the population, it's concentrated in assets like London house values that do little to expand people's creative possibilities. Study after study has shown that access to relatively small amounts of capital can have a much greater impact on people's sense of efficacy and opportunity than increases in income. Yet nearly a third of our adult population effectively has no savings at all. And one of the first casualties of austerity were policies like the Children's Trust Fund and the Savings Gateway, explicitly designed to address this deficit. The idea that one class is simply by its nature bound to rule another is seen as reactionary, but the assumption that only a certain strata of people, of learners, of workers, of places can be expected to be creative endures. Whatever its implications, the most radical element of the power to create is the idea itself. For the reasons I outlined earlier, the idea that the creative life is something only for an elite is being questioned. But there's a problem. So long and so deep as that assumption held sway, it's deeply inscribed into our society's institutions. In one way or another, we spend most of our lives working in or with, or sometimes against institutions. And it's their working practices, what I'm going to describe as sorting, splitting, and subordinating, that present a second major barrier to the power to create. Sorting is the assumption that only a certain number of roles within an institution can be creative, in the sense of allowing and expecting autonomy, engagement, fulfillment, and that an essential role of management is to sort posts and people into a structure with the most creative jobs at or near the top. And sorting is also a purpose, for some, the core purpose of our educational institutions. The ultimate goal of formal education should surely be to inculcate a love of learning and to guide young people into finding the areas in which they can most fully and successfully express themselves to the benefit of society. Instead, we have a system which prizes one set of intellectual attributes, forces young people to focus on those attributes, and then sorts them by whether or not they're deemed to possess them. Part of our creativity lies in the plurality of our social existence. A second institutional habit, splitting, involves institutions allocating people a role and separating this from the other multiple roles they occupy. We sometimes talk about the different interests of public service workers, teachers, police officers, care workers, and public service consumers, parents, citizens, clients. But teachers are parents. Police officers are citizens. Most care workers will at some time or another find themselves or a loved one needing care. And you see the same phenomenon in the private sector. Workers, whether on the factory floor, the shop counter, or in an office, are motivated by pride in what they're producing. It's something they would happily use as well as produce, buy as well as sell. For a contrast, think of the financial services sector, where for decades workers were incentivized to sell poor products on the basis of misleading information. When the only way to cope at work is to leave your values and human sympathies at home in the morning, it's not surprising that people feel demoralized and jaded. When LSE anthropologist David Graeber published an article last year arguing that most occupations, starting with his friend the high-powered corporate lawyer, comprise what he called bullshit jobs, it went globally viral. Splitting is particularly prevalent in institutions displaying the final institutional habit, subordination. This was first identified by my own intellectual hero, Max Weber, bureaucracy's first and greatest analyst. He described the distinction between an institution's real-world goals and its rule-based goals. And he observed that organizations over time tend to subordinate the former to the latter. You can see this in corporations created and built by proud entrepreneurs, engineers, designers with a market-beating service or product, but which subsequently become obsessed by size or shareholder returns. John Kay cites ICI as a business that was highly successful while its goal was to be a world-class creator of chemicals, but which soon crashed after it changed its goal and strategy, explicitly subordinating everything to maximizing shareholder returns. And it happens also in organizations claiming to operate in the public interest. Instead of empowering their employees to reconcile the inherent tensions between short-term organizational interests and public duties, institutions tend to subordinate the latter to the former. The Police Federation provided a classic newsworthy example until a few weeks ago when it accepted in full recommendations crafted by the RSA. The moment the Fed grasped that the interests of the police must be brought into alignment with those of the public was the moment when it became possible to tap fully into the creative capacities of its staff and activists. Most large organizations are trying to grapple with these institutional habits and their impact on their capacity to recruit, retain, and motivate creative employees. There are many institutions, private sector organizations, charities like the Women's Institute or the Scouts, which have shown the willingness to work in different, more creative ways. But there are too few examples, and this is because the systems that drive institutions, from financial markets to government funding regimes, are still as likely to incentivize the wrong practices as the right ones. Exclusive assumptions and organizational conventions are barriers to more people living more creatively. But what about a final, even more fundamental block? Advocates of the power to create need to have something to say about the kind of social and economic context in which creativity is most likely to be a realistic path for the most people. And given that it is a core function of government in a democracy to enable everyone to be able to participate fully in society, this final barrier takes us to the role of the state. As a goal, creative lives for all leads to a profound reconsideration of the role and working methods of government. In some areas, the state should do more than today's, in others, less. Greater activism is needed in shaping the market and its outcomes. The creative state would ensure open markets with low barriers of entry and diverse forms of ownership, encourage and enforce permissive intellectual property regimes, encourage modern employment practices, demand that utilities and essential services, including the global internet giants, are run with the public interest at heart, and they'd invest in tomorrow's infrastructure, including the institutions which foster and grow innovation. As Eric Beinhocker and Nick Hanauer have recently argued, the greatest achievements of capitalism lie less in economic growth or profit, but in helping find solutions to the problems that matter to us. Now we need a new partnership, not mountains of regulation, but genuine grown-up partnership between modern government and enlightened business to help us solve the problem of people locked out of the possibility of a creative life. On the other hand, the governors of the state, particularly the central state, need to be aware that its scale, complexity and accountability often make it badly suited to human-scale interventions. The pace of change and growing interdependencies of the modern world mean that more policy challenges, youth unemployment, meeting care needs, are highly complex. Today's citizens aspiring to greater self-determination want a state that enables them to feel self-reliant, not one which creates and reinforces dependency. At the RSA, we work with the principle of social productivity, which is that public sector interventions should be judged by the degree to which they enable people to better contribute to meeting their own needs. The creative society would also, of course, seek to devolve power to the lowest effective level, not just because the centre is too distant, but because we would encourage places to do things in substantively different ways, not just experiments in service delivery, but experiments in place shaping, indeed experiments in living. More profoundly, the values and analysis behind the power to create encourage a questioning of the very idea of traditional policy making. The success of most social policy interventions, the interventions that draw upon and foster public creativity, rely on what academic and former Canadian Cabinet Secretary Jocelyn Burgoyne calls civic effects. That is public engagement, public mobilisation, behaviour change. But these civic effects are much more likely to emerge from political leaders articulating a clear vision, convening new conversations and collaborations, leading by doing, than through the slow, cumbersome process of developing and implementing policy. When it comes to social policy, politicians and managers need to replace the blunt tools of policy making with those of design, in which continuous experimentation, learning by failing, co-producing with consumers and users is the norm. And this, of course, has major implications for our systems of lawmaking and accountability. A few months ago, I sent a very early version of this speech to my old friend, the writer and social innovator, Charles Leadbeater. In his diplomatic but painfully frank response, he used a phrase that stuck in my mind. Having studied private, public and third sector organisations for many years, Charlie has concluded that the most effective comprise, in his words, creative communities with a cause. Nicely for us, this echoes and develops the view of a previous RSA chair, Charles Handy, who said, a good business is a community with a purpose. The road to a more creative society will be crazy paved, with changes large and small. But that road will only be laid because our society as a whole believes in progress. For what Charlie says of organisations is true of places and societies. They too must be creative communities with a cause. Creativity, as I've argued this evening, is an essential part of the mix, but it does not flourish in a vacuum. Community points to the importance of an open, trusting, collaborative culture where different people with different backgrounds, values and attributes mix easily with each other. Research suggests social trust is as powerfully correlated with economic dynamism as levels of tax, regulation or education. And the idea of a cause echoes my point about the kinds of institutional and political leadership which inspires and fosters a creative citizenry. Leadership that is visionary, authentic, open, accountable in relation to goals. Whatever the following winds of change, the power to create requires a form of leadership that can restore our lost faith in social progress. The impact of the RSA's mission does not lie in a definition, a statement, or sadly for me, a speech. It will depend on the focused ideas and action of this great society. Looking back through our history, from the country's first public art exhibition in the 18th century, to arguing for children to go to school rather than up chimneys in the 19th century, to creating vocational qualifications in the 20th century, the RSA has always been in the business of expanding the power to create. But we've only ever made a difference by reaching out. These are not ideas we claim to own or want to protect, but something to share and grow. So my invitation to you is to help us develop our ideas and their practical applications. help us to make the RSA the kind of institution that exemplifies the power to create.